Yeah.
Please do the recording.
So we're just starting now.
All right.
So you're in Geneva, and here I am in Wharton, somewhere between Lancaster and Kendal. I have a grey day. You have a very nice sunny day, I hope. So
Yeah.
has Switzerland's experience of the coronavirus been very different from Britain?
Well, in some ways, yes, and in some other ways, not so different. But well, the timing was different. I think Switzerland, and especially the Italian speaking part and the French speaking part were hit before the UK, coming from Italy.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
So the timing was different, and it's interesting because I was in Switzerland before the lockdown situation happened in the UK, but after the lockdown happened in Switzerland. So I saw the differences because I traveled back to the UK where nothing was happening in terms of restrictions. It was interesting to see
but
that.
I had already isolated myself because I have an autoimmune problem.
Yeah.
So on the 11th or 12th of March, I made a decision that I would start to isolate because I had a close encounter with some people who had returned from a skiing holiday in Italy, and had been tested, and luckily they had been found negative. But it sort of brought me up with a jolt that I have a predisposition to get every viral infection going, and here I was having a meeting that involved people who had come back from a skiing holiday, which is one of the reasons why this area, initially at least, had so many incidences of coronavirus, and the local airport specializes in skiing holidays.
I see. Well, lucky you that, well, you had the opportunity to talk to these people and you were not infected.
Yeah.
I had a couple of friends who got the coronavirus because they were in touch with some colleagues who got it from Italy or who went to Italy themselves, and they got the virus very early. And as you said, before policymakers, before government reacted. So this is really an issue of timing. But these differences between the different parts of Switzerland is also interesting because the German-speaking part they had less cases, less coronavirus cases, and less death than the Italian and the French-speaking part. And I think this also explains the reaction of the people, which was very different. In the German-speaking part, you may have heard that this was also the case in Germany, but there were some protests from some people saying that the restrictions were exaggerated.
And yesterday again as well.
Yes. And this was the case in the German-speaking part, while in the French-speaking part, closer to also what happened in France or in Italy, people were more happy actually with these restrictions, and many people are saying that they fear about the lifting of the restrictions. It's a very different. This is not only about the number of cases and how the different parts of Switzerland were hit, but this has also to do, I suppose, with the relationship to the state. And I suppose in the French-speaking part, the state we seem to accept also higher intervention from the state compared with the German-speaking.
Sorry, do you think that also has a link with the role of epidemiologists, statisticians, and others? I mean, in Britain, the government falls back on, we are following scientific data, we are following scientific advice. But when you look behind those statements, there are actually very different kinds of data and very different kinds of scenarios that are being sketched out. You know, different groups of epidemiological modelers are saying rather different things. There's a difference between that and a lot of public health officials. Public Health England is responding in a different way from other health bodies. Is there that sense of both dependence on expert advice and expert data, but also that it's very contradictory?
Yeah, yeah. Well, based on our previous correspondence, I also felt that we have the same here in Switzerland with some epidemiologists that were highly influential in driving, informing policymakers more than others. But I don't exactly know the differences with the different parts of Switzerland. I cannot tell here, but I also have this impression that epidemiologists, uh, yes, were listened to more than some other scientists, and as you said, also more interestingly, this transition from scientific evidence um, into recommendations were just completely becoming that's the truth. And all the debates, the underlying debates, scientific debates about the assumptions, about
Yes.
also the doubts we have about these models, for example, epistemological models, were completely omitted. So it's yeah, I don't think that it's very different from the UK here, but I cannot tell for the other parts of Switzerland. But what I can see from the media and from general communication from governments, I don't see any big difference between the UK and the French speaking part. What I think, maybe I'm wrong, but this is maybe with the density of the and the number of the media, but you know the French speaking part is it's a small region. We just have 2-3 million of people, millions of people. So there are not so many media and not so many critical media as well. It might be different from some larger countries like the UK or France, where we have also, you know, left wing but also right wing media who are criticizing government's action. And
Sorry, can I just interrupt you there?
yeah, sure.
You said about criticizing government's actions. One of the things I think that's noticeable that it just isn't there is not criticizing government, which has happened, but criticizing the scientific expertise, having some kind of critical approach to it, and precisely looking at the kinds of assumptions that are built into it that you mentioned just now. Has there been any? I mean, my own feeling is it's a glaring absence in the UK context, in spite of having a very large media and a very large number of very active journalists. It's almost as though the force of the pandemic and what it represents, that people want expertise and aren't actually questioning the so-called expert statements of fact that are circulating, which are often somewhat contradictory. So,
Yeah.
is there that kind of critique of the scientific? Well, that's how it's been glossed. I mean, but a lot of it is epidemiological modelists. I mean, and also in South Africa, there's a lot of epidemiological modelling that is underpinning government action. But alongside that, there are also other sources of scientific expertise, including from medical professionals as well, saying something rather different.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you're probably right. There is not so much, not so many media and public discussion questioning these models and informing these decisions. I think this is a degree to what extent this critical discussion happens, and I have the impression that in Switzerland, or at least in this French-speaking Switzerland, this is even more so, that there is a complete absence. But maybe you're right. This is the general trend, is that there is not so many people. I've read a couple of pieces who are a little bit more critical with this expertise, but it's true that it seems to be very, very difficult for philosophers, historians to take the risk of contesting these medical power, which is seizing now the situation, and
Yes.
part of the medical power, of course, because I've read one piece from another medical expert, doctor, who was also a little bit criticizing this lockdown situation and the fact that we could not even, for example, organize funerals, or we could not visit elderly people. So some people took the risk, but it seems to be very difficult. Yeah.
Why do you think, I mean, I'm sort of thinking of sociology here, and sociology has a lot of very good quantitative sociology. Um, why is it that there is a silence from colleagues? Do you think there's long-term work going on where they're looking at all of this kind of apparatus of science that's being produced? I mean, I was expecting there to be some, signs of critical commentary from our quantitative colleagues. Does that surprise you?
Well, it does not surprise me so much here, at least here in this context of Switzerland, where the sociologists who are using quantitative methods are not necessarily the most critical ones, questioning sometimes the initial underlying assumptions of some of the situation. Sometimes they are, for example, going hand with epidemiologists and trying to for example, I don't know, measure social distancing or measure impact of social distancing, but they are not necessarily always questioning the discourses, the narrative that is behind it. So and issues of power, for example. So
yes,
at least in Switzerland, I have the impression that maybe this is here a lack of these sociologists and social scientists in general who are using quantitative methods, who maybe lack some critical perspective in terms of power and questioning these dominant norms that are sometimes just taken for granted. So I'm not that surprised, I would say.
But the corollary of what you're saying is that it's up to the rest of us to produce that narrative, that much more critical narrative. If our quantitative colleagues are focusing much more on the technologies and looking at whether they're robust, maybe it's the rest of us who ought to be interrogating the assumptions that go into such things. But there is very little sign of that happening as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't want to speak for all these people. I'm sure that there is some critical discussion, for example, in terms of numbers. We all know and we have all read the difficulty to measure in a robust way number of cases, number of deaths, because it highly depends on, as you said, the number of tests and what is considered to be a death due to the coronavirus, which is also a big issue. Yeah. So there is some discussion about this statistical evidence and the statistical narrative behind it. But on the other hand, when it's seized by politicians, it's true that this completely disappears. But I agree. We have here a role to play. The problem is probably that, again, I don't know if probably sociologists, there is a difficulty maybe to also collaborate together with these epidemiologists or with these other people in health studies and maybe add this critical perspective to it, because they don't necessarily understand each other, and maybe this is one reason why it's not so present. But I agree. For example, in my case, I'm working on social network analysis, but I'm using social network analysis so I could connect to, in some ways, to these, diffusion models through networks, but I don't feel that I have the expertise to criticize so much the models that are underlying these decisions. And as I told you, I think in one email, some network analysts are doing this, but yeah, probably it's just one voice that is a bit lost.
Yes.
And myself, who could maybe potentially argue against some of these assumptions and these models, in terms of issues of power and etc. I don't know the models well enough to criticize them. So I don't know, but this might be a reason.
There may be more practical, just sort of very grounded practical considerations. Many of our colleagues have caring responsibilities, and are working in home circumstances that don't necessarily give them lots of room. No. So we too are subject to the same kinds of limitations that all other people are experiencing.
Yeah.
So I think that's another important factor, that people are ground down by the practicalities, and having headspace room to develop new research projects is difficult for many people.
Of course, yeah. Although I'm admiring. I'm always very impressed by some people. Like I just read that Angus, for example, just got some funding for a new project on the coronavirus and drug use. There are some people who, and including social scientists, who are very, very fast in tackling these issues. But I don't know. In some ways, again, this is maybe not necessarily engaging directly with the work of these other scientists, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
Could we talk a bit about this idea of segmented shielding that I've become interested in? I mean, that's the product of medical epidemiology and a group of modelers sort of developing ideas about deliberately structuring the population in terms of the vulnerable, the shielders, and as it describes it, the healthy 60%.
Yes. Well,
what do you? I mean, that isn't just modelling, is it? That's something that's much more prescriptive. Exactly. And much more about social engineering than it is about modelling, I think.
I don't know if they conducted some simulations using this kind of division of the population. I can imagine that some basic models could be used, in terms of risk of contagion and divisions of these three groups in terms of mobility, and maybe they simulated this kind of models and showed that maybe this is one way of finding this balance between herd immunity and protecting the most vulnerable people. But I agree, this is well, at least this is the simulation, this is the model, but then suggesting this as a policy is of course not only a statistical or mathematical model. This is also of course something that should be discussed by social scientists.
I mean, it's quite ironic, isn't it, that I am one of the vulnerable. You are a shielder for your mother, who is one of the vulnerable. So we are part of 120%, the vulnerable, another 20% shielders. But you also have connections with other people. So the rest of the population is not immune from social contacts with any of us, really. I mean, I have conversations on the doorstep with my postman, who I've known for 20 years.
Yeah.
taking some precautions, but the model breaks down with the complexity of social networking, doesn't it? Of social relationships.
Absolutely, yeah. No, that's a very good point. I think these kind of models usually has very basic, simple ways of dividing the population, which first ignores, yes, the networking pattern that we have. To what extent are we considered as a cheater or as someone who can just go safely outside?
Yes.
Because at a degree of two, at the distance of two, we can have, of course, many of us have someone who is vulnerable, and at the degree of two, or even at the degree of one, depending on what we consider being these people we are in touch with, because we can meet one person only once a month or a week, and infect this person if we are staying close and long time with them. So this ignores a little bit the social patterning, and this ignores also, I think, what people want for themselves, right?
Yes.
I was I thought that was very striking. This is not scientific evidence at all. This is just my own feeling. But I don't know if you've noticed that. But among the people who are aged around 50s, 60s, many people are actually very anxious. Or of course there is a high variation among them, but many people among this age category are actually quite anxious about their own health conditions, even if they are not necessarily particularly at risk. And among those who are older, here I'm talking about 75, 80 and above. My father and many of his friends are of this age, and actually have a different perspective on all of this. They are saying, my parents-in-law are also in this category. Of course, they may be very specific, but I was still very surprised that among these older people, actually, they don't necessarily want to be protected. They don't necessarily want to stop living as they were living before. So it highly depends on the people. And some people are saying, I'm more than 80 years old now. If I'm going to get the coronavirus and I will die, well, that's life. So this kind of reasoning was less present among those who were a bit younger. I was surprised. So again, this is just overlooking, ignoring what people mean and what the people's view on their own lives. So that would be also
That's
very
very interesting,
problematic.
isn't it? That it's not only that people are wanting to live their life in the way they did before, but they just want to live their life.
Yes.
And living your life, in four walls is not living in the best sense of the word. So to sort of draw some of these things together, then, do you think that this is the way in which future sociology ought to be developing in response to what's happening? That it should be looking at the sense that people are making and the choices that they're making about what contacts they have and how those are changing over time. I mean, is that what we ought to be focusing our attention on?
Well, at least that's one aspect I think we should focus our attention to, because again, thus using quantitative methods, social scientists and others may sometimes ignore this aspect and focus more on the technological aspect or the physical aspect, and ignores these more subjective dimensions. So I think, yes, that's one aspect I think
If that's
sociology
one,
should.
what are the others?
Well, I think it highly depends on what we would like to focus on here, because when I thought a little bit about all of this, and thanks again for encouraging me to think about this, Lise. I think it highly depends on what we are interested in. Is it about the causes? Is it about how we are coping now with this situation? Or is it about the consequences of this pandemic? It highly depends on that. But I suppose that for all these three aspects, um, sociologists might have some answers and may contribute significantly to this situation. For example, if we think about the causes of the pandemic, again, this is not just, or it seems that it's not just about a virus and animals. This is also about, this human behaviors and the relationship between animals and well, non-humans and humans. So I think for all these dimensions, there is something here that is about well, social behaviors, and sociologists must take their part into it.
I think maybe that's the point at which we should stop. To thank you very much for a really interesting conversation.
Well, you're welcome. You're welcome, Lise.
Yeah, we might later pick up on some of these points because it's obviously not going to go away very quickly. So we might have another opportunity to return to some of these questions. So thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I wanted to say, just to finish on a final word, Lise, um, we talked about expertise very briefly, but just to mention that we should also question, of course, as we did in this talk, question what we mean by experts, because as we all know, we need to listen also to those who have less power. So I think this, I'm sure that you agree with this. We need also to listen to those people who are not designated themselves or by others as experts, and who have less power, but who have lots to say about this pandemic and how they want to cope with this. So I think this is also something we need to consider when we are talking about subjectivities, not only about expertise, but the everyday lives of the people.
Yes, people are experts on their own lives. I absolutely agree with you.
Yes. Thank you.